Centuries after the sundering of the World Eater's Legion, in the mid-38th millennium, the galaxy trembled beneath the weight of Angron's unholy wrath once more. Leading an army of 50,000 Chaos Space Marines, along with hordes of other Chaos-aligned forces, the Red Angel spearheaded a campaign of annihilation that scorched over 70 Imperial sectors. For over 2 standard centuries, Angron's forces carved a wide swath of destruction through Imperial space, leaving billions dead in their wake. This period would be remembered in Imperial archives as the Dominion of Fire, and it saw some of the bloodiest conflicts of the millennium. Entire systems would fall under Angron's dominion, becoming charnel houses dedicated to the blood god. The Imperium itself, reeling from such sustained and brutal assaults, marshaled its forces for a brave counteroffensive of an unprecedented scale. A coordination of 4 Space Marine chapters, 2 mighty Titan legions, and over 30 regiments of Astra Militarum launched a massive Imperial crusade to reclaim the territories lost to Angron's blood-drenched campaign. The war spanned some decades, with countless battles fought to wrestle control from the grips of chaos. And though victory came, it came at a staggering cost, as Imperial forces ultimately would recover 90% of the territory lost to Angron's rampage, and the Dominion of Fire, while ultimately a failed conquest, left permanent scars upon the Imperium that would endure to this day. The brutal efficiency and scale of the campaign demonstrated the chilling effectiveness of chaos under a demon Primarch's leadership, and solidified Angron as one of the Imperium's most deadly foes. Even now, the echoes of Skalathrax and the Dominion of Fire resonate across the Imperium, as the World Eaters once again became fragmented, yet unrelenting after this campaign. But they do remain a scourge upon the galaxy, their warbands essentially seeking blood and skulls for Khorne in every battle they engage in. One of the next major events involving the World Eaters would be the Feast of 100 Duels, which stands as one of the reminders of the brutal traditions that the World Eaters and their eternal devotion to Khorne has created. This centennial gathering, known as the Feast of Blades, had long been a sacred ritual for the descendants of the Imperial Fists. A time where they gathered their greatest bladesmen and clashed in ritual duels, honoring their legacy and martial prowess. Yet, in a cruel and unforeseen twist of fate, this celebration of skill and honor would become the target of an unprovoked incursion from the World Eaters. The World Eaters, driven by their ceaseless need for blood and the demand for skulls, shattered the defenses of the Chosen World, sweeping through with a terrifying speed as the Imperial Fist's finest swordsmen and those of their gene descendants fought valiantly to defend their sacred traditions. Unfortunately, they would find themselves locked in a deadly contest against the most relentless forces, some of the most relentless forces of the World Eaters, leading to a brutal brouhaha where the combat was a brutal clash of steel and savagery, as the Imperial Fist's power swords met the monstrous chain axes and flails of the World Eaters. Despite their nigh unparalleled skill, the Imperial Fists were ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity and savagery of their opponents. As the final blows were struck, the halls of the feast were drenched in the hot blood of their champions, as the sons of Dorne were sacrificed as a grim offering to the god of war. Thus, the Feast of 100 Duels became a battleground, which would honor one of the 4 craven gods. Despite this, the Imperial Fists would gain reinforcements and repel the World Eaters, and since Khorne cares not from whence the blood is spilled, the skies themselves rattled with his approval, as being a harbinger to further bloodshed which would come. Another event of great galactic importance occurred on the quarantined world of Gladius, where the Drukhari witch cult of the Seventh Woe sought out a challenge unlike any they had faced before: the violent, brutal warriors of the World Eaters. This would become yet another deadly contest which would feed the god of war, and the contest which would follow in the great fang-lined fighting pits became one of the most vicious and swift duels ever witnessed on Gladius. The Demon Prince masters who oversaw the trials watched in awe as the combat unfolded, as dozens of witches and World Eaters fell upon one another in a whirlwind of blade and fury. The speed and intensity of the combat delighted Khorne, whose favor was made apparent when a rain of blood began to fall from the heavens. In a grotesque display of his power, Khorne's blood brought the slain back to life, allowing the carnage to continue unabated. The ferocity of the duels would forge a bond of mutual respect and trust, tenuous though it may be between the two factions, one born of an unrelenting thirst for violence. As it seemed, Khorne had claimed these Drukhari as his own. This brutal contest would ultimately set the stage for what would become known as the Great Blood Wager of Anathema Quartus, a deadly alliance born of bloodshed between the World Eaters and the Drukhari of the witch cult of the Seven Woes. Eventually, on the peaceful world of Exotia, there would appear a figure known as the Red Messiah, who heralded the fall of the planet into madness. Under his influence, the population fell into the worship of Khorne, as their minds were consumed by bloodlust and the slaughter that would soon follow. The Red Messiah, revealed to be a devout follower of the blood god, commanded his astropathic choir to call in raiders from the Maelstrom. In a terrifying display of Khorne's wrath, midnight attacks from bands of bloodletters began to tear apart the planet, their rampage heralding the beginning of the Red Tide. Shortly thereafter, the Red Corsairs, bolstered by no fewer than 300 original Khorne berserkers, descended upon the world with a devastating force, pushing the planet's people into an abyss of madness and destruction, and eliminating the last scant few loyalist elements within the world. The Red Messiah's true nature had been revealed, and the world would now become a blood-soaked tribute to Khorne. Up next would be the Skull Hunt of Octarius, which occurred sometime within the 41st millennium, and it saw the World Eaters, led by Vodha, Blood Price, descend upon the Octarius system. The constant, ever-escalating violence between the Orcs and the Tyranids in the region had already caught the attention of Khorne, and the World Eaters sought to add their own contributions to said bloodshed. So Bloodpierce, eager to offer the skulls of his enemies to the Skull Throne, believed that the chaos of the Octarius War would prove the perfect opportunity to do so. Within the span of a single Terran years, the World Eaters slaughtered countless creatures within the region, offering up more than 8,000 skulls to the Skull Throne individually, the smallest of which was the size of a boulder. Vodha himself ascended to demonhood after a monumentous battle where he slew a Hierophant Biotitan by himself with the great axe of a fallen Orc warlord. For Khorne, this slaughter was a glorious offering. The bloodletting was an affirmation of his dominion over this battlefield. But the World Eaters, their lust for skulls unquenchable, were not content to stop there, as they would continue their hunt, their thirst for violence and sacrifice leading them ever onward, further and further into the depths of the Eye of Terror, and campaigns across the galaxy. The fall of Ebon Vale occurred at an unknown date within the 41st millennium, and it saw Deathwatch Fortress Ebon Vale assailed by scores of World Eaters under the leadership of Chaos Lord Invocatus, supported by Demon Engine allies from the Brazen Beasts. Invocatus led this vicious raid on the Deathwatch's arsenals, seeking powerful Adeptus Astartes war gear and ancient battle artifacts. The Deathwatch, known for their ability to withstand even the most dangerous foes of the Imperium, fought fiercely to protect the secrets of Ebon Vale. Despite their tenacity, the World Eaters' onslaught was brutal, and their departure left nothing behind but devastation. Empty weapon vaults, along with countless black-armored corpses of the Deathwatch warriors who had perished in the defense of their sacred mission. The assault had not only decimated the Deathwatch forces within the sector, but led to the dangerous spread of a potential horde infestation that would leave entire civilized worlds reduced to nothing more than barren, lifeless husks. The next major campaign was The Blood Runs Hot, was the fall of Valhalla, and it occurred within the 41st millennium, yet again at an unknown date. And it saw how warriors of the world face an incursion of World Eaters. Now the Tau, used to having tactical superiority and their martial discipline to fall back on, initially maintained their distance, using their superior firepower to keep the World Eaters at bay. Yet as the battles raged on, some unforeseen circumstances occurred. The infectious rage of Khorne began to take root in the hearts of the Tau's own cadres. The disciplined fire warriors, so accustomed to fighting with cold calculation from a distance, found themselves overcome by the very rage of their enemies. War cries long forgotten since the unification of the Tau's homeworld echoed across the battlefield as the Tau began to engage Chaos Spawn in close quarters combat. The result was catastrophic. Millions upon millions of Tau soldiers perished before the ethereal cast could intervene, using their calming influence to restore order, but even then the damage was done. The Tau had lost too many forces and were forced to retreat, their ranks decimated, and the once unshakable discipline of the Tau shattered by the insatiable bloodlust of the World Eaters. In 474 M41, the first war for Armageddon would occur, and it was not just a simple war for a planet, but rather a clash of fate and destiny, along with an insatiable thirst for blood being unleashed, which would reverberate throughout the entirety of the Imperium and the galaxy at large. Its origin lies in the terrifying, unexpected arrival of forces within the very edges of the Imperial Armageddon system within the Segmentum Solar, in particular that of a massive, ancient space hulk known as the Devourer of Stars. This space-born behemoth was a relic of a time long forgotten, and it was a harbinger of a bloody conflict that would leave the strategically vital hive world of Armageddon permanently scarred. For centuries, the forces of chaos had long been fractured as a collection of warring factions, each vying for dominance. In the wake of the Horus Heresy, Angron, demon primarch of the World Eaters, had long sought to unite the scattered remnants of his legion, but the brutal and bloodthirsty nature of his sons, along with the long-held hate for him, made them a rather unmanageable force, more prone to infighting and attempting to slaughter him and each other than turning their blades against the Imperium proper. Yet the Devourer of Stars presented Angron with an opportunity, a chance for a unified assault upon the Imperium, albeit one without direction or purpose, driven by the chaotic tides of the warp. The Hulk's sudden appearance in the Armageddon system, far removed from the Eye of Terror, signaled the very onset of this conflict. How or why the Devourer of Stars was drawn to this world remains unknown. Was it guided by the capricious whims of the Chaos Gods, or was it simply deposited there after the unpredictable currents of the warp had spat it out into real space? Whatever the case, the arrival of this massive ship set in motion a series of events that would culminate in one of the most brutal wars the Imperium had ever faced. When Angron and his World Eaters descended upon Armageddon, they encountered rather fierce Imperial resistance. The defenders, led by the legendary Great Wolf Logan Grimnar of the Space Wolves, initially stood firm against the tide of the Khorne madness. The World Eaters would then make a quick and bloody advance across the continent of Armageddon Prime, crushing Imperial forces with a devastating speed that would leave even the White Scars impressed. However, the defenders of Armageddon did not surrender easily, falling back to the dense equatorial jungles separating Armageddon Prime from the continent of Armageddon Secundus. There they established a defensive line, awaiting for the inevitable return of Angron's forces. Angron, confident in his victory and lulled by the success of his initial campaign, grew complacent as he spent several weeks erecting vast temples and monoliths dedicated to Khorne, his bloodthirsty patron. At first glance, it appeared as nothing more than a triumphant display of the World Eater's glory and dominance. However, this was not a mere victory celebration, as Angron's true intentions were more underhanded and desperate. The warp storm that had enabled his summoning and his continued existence upon the material plane was dissipating, and the demonic forces that he had led were tied to the ever-changing tides of the warp, leading them to be at risk of being pulled back into the Imperium. Angron's actions were not just a show, as he was desperately attempting to anchor himself and his demonic forces within the material realm, lest they all be lost to the warp. This strategic error proved costly. By the time Angron was finally ready to renew his assault through Armageddon's jungles, the Imperial defenders had solidified their positions and they were ready for him. Despite his initial advantage, the World Eater's reckless charge into the Imperial line would be met with an unexpectedly fierce and rather well-tuned resistance. At the heart of this defense once again stood Logan Grimnar and his Space Wolves, holding the line against the demonic tide. But Angron, ever the bludgeon of Khorne, led his own personal retinue of Khornate demon princes, along with the terrifying bloodletters, against the very strongest point of the Imperial defense, aiming to crush Grimnar and end the war once and for all with a singular decisive blow. It was at this critical moment that the Imperium's trump card was played. A full company of Grey Knights would appear, the Imperium's most elite and psychically empowered Astartes, greater even than the Custodes who hide away within the Imperial Palace, as they would teleport into the midst of Angron's honor guard. The ensuing battle was nothing short of climactic, as the skies above the jungle world were rent asunder by the clash of unearthly forces, as the burning white light of the Grey Knights met the dark and bloody fury of the Khorne demons. The Grey Knights fought with every last ounce of their strength, and at great cost too, but eventually they succeeded in annihilating Angron's personal retinue. But it was not without sacrifice, as the Grey Knights themselves were nearly consumed by the energies unleashed when they faced Angron, who despite his defeat was still a being who was able to spread terrifying power and malevolence. In a desperate final act, the Grey Knights summoned the full might of their psychic power and unleashed a psychic blast that obliterated Angron's entire corporeal form. The explosion of energy banished the demon Primarch's essence back into the Imperium, where it would remain for 100 years before returning. Though Angron was destroyed, the cost was immense, as a significant amount of the Grey Knights' company, including the revered Grand Master, perished during the assault, leaving their sacrifice as a bitter reminder of the cost of victory against a demon Primarch. With the death of Angron, the World Eaters were thrown into chaos. The demons of Khorne, once summoned to the mortal realm, would be swiftly banished along with their master, and the remaining World Eaters, with their unity shattered and their leadership broken, would fall back into the Eye of Terror, defeated and disorganized. This was merely the first War for Armageddon, one where the Imperium was victorious, but at great cost, losing resources that would likely never be fully made up. Now, to go into further detail, before the Space Hulk's arrival at Armageddon, the world itself had already begun to spiral into chaos, as a strange phenomena and warp-fueled disruptions sparked rather notable unrest across the hive world. This, along with massive warp storms, severed the planet from Imperial communications along with supply lines, and widespread food shortages provided fertile grounds for a chaos cultist rebellion. Armed uprisings would erupt across several hive cities within the world, particularly in the northern subcontinent of Armageddon Prime, where the Planetary Defense Forces and the Armageddon Steel Legion managed to suppress incursions. In the south, the rebellions in the scattered western hives and in the north proved significantly more tenacious. Imperial commanders, seeing no evidence of external manipulation, dismissed the revolts as mere civil unrest. The warp storm's eventual dissipation reinforced this assumption, and no additional reinforcements were sent, despite the world outright begging for aid. The Imperium's fragile calm was shattered when the Devourer of Stars emerged from the warp, disgorging an unholy amount of chaos onto the surface of Armageddon, a veritable army of demons and World Eaters. And at the head of this massive invasion stood Angron, the demon Primarch of the World Eaters, accompanied by millions of Chaos cultists, demons, and Chaos Space Marines from his own legion. Amongst these invaders were the Children of Sanguinary Unholies, a fanatical cult devoted to Khorne, and the Curer Parotia, 12 demonic champions whose blood-soaked deeds earned Khorne's favor. As this nightmarish host swept across the planet, the forces of chaos unleashed their insidious influence. Nearly all of Armageddon's planetary defense forces turned traitor, swearing allegiance to the ruinous powers merely due to their influence, turning their weapons on their former comrades and those who still remained loyal. Within weeks, the defenders of Armageddon Prime were overwhelmed. The loyalists routed from the northern subcontinent and forced to retreat within the equatorial jungles, joining forces with the defenders of Armageddon Secundus' own defenders. Together, they prepared for a desperate stand along the rivers Styx and Charon, the planet's last natural barriers. As the loyalist forces barricaded and braced for annihilation, an unexpected turn of events would occur, and chaos's advance would stall. The warp storm that had brought the Devourer of Stars to Armageddon began to dissipate. This critical shift severed the flow of warp energies that sustained Angron and his demonic forces to the Materium. Without this lifeline, Angron and his demonic hosts could no longer maintain their presence within real space, causing their invasion to falter and stall, while Angron and his demon princes erected monuments that would allow for their continued existence within real space. By the time Angron and his army had emerged from the jungles to resume their assault after creating their monuments, they found an emboldened and renewed enemy force waiting for them. The defenders regrouped along both the river Styx and Charon, their backs to the last natural lines of defense the planet had. and they were also bolstered by the Space Wolves. The Astartes of the Great Wolf, Logan Grimnar, responded to the Hive World's distress signal. With their characteristic ferocity, unknown to the forces of chaos, Grimnar had also called upon the Imperium's most secret of weapons, the Grey Knights, the elite chapter of psychic warriors and demon hunters, under the aegis of the Ordo Malleus. The Grey Knights were amongst the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets, and even most of their allies in the Astartes had no knowledge of their existence. Yet Logan Grimnar had encountered these warriors before, and as a chapter master, he had been spared the mind wipe that was most common amongst witnesses of the Grey Knights. Chaos soon met the reinforced Imperium in a series of massive battles along the rivers. In the east, the Imperial defenders held their line against Chaos and its unending horde of demons. However, in the west, Angron himself led a ferocious assault, breaking through the defenders and driving them towards Hive Infernus and Hive Hell's Reach. It was here that Logan Grimnar unleashed the Grey Knights, teleporting them directly into the heart of Chaos and the host of Angron's forces. In order to confront the Demon Primarch and his demon princes, the Grey Knights, led by brother Captain Tarmiel Arulon, fought with an unmatched valor and nobility against Angron and his Khornate champions. Amongst them was Squad Castan, which suffered devastating losses at Angron's hands. The Primarch's ferocity seemed nigh unstoppable, even against the unparalleled power of the Demon Hunters, who had been crafted from the very own Emperor's gene seed. As the battle reached its zenith, the Grey Knights that remained standing were Hyperion, a psyker and a master of pyromancy, and no others. In a desperate act of psychic power, Hyperion shattered Angron's demonic weapon, Blackblade, a Khornate relic of immense power which had once tasted Sanguinius's very blood. Though the strain caused him to collapse, his actions weakened the Demon Primarch and allowed Aurelian, one of the other surviving Grey Knights, to confront the bladeless monster. In a cataclysmic duel, Aurelian sacrificed his life to banish Angron back into the warp. The cost was staggering. Of the 109 Grey Knights deployed, only 13 survived the battle. Hyperion, barely alive, was recovered by the Space Wolves from the blood-soaked battlefield. His heroic deeds earned him the honorific Bladebreaker, though his survival came at a great personal cost, as augmetics would have to be used to replace much of his face and skull, as he required 4 solar months of recovery before returning to duty. The banishment of Angron broke the spirit of the remaining Chaos forces, who without their leader essentially crumbled in upon themselves as the demons vanished back into the warp and the world eaters retreated back to the Devourer of Stars and fled into the warp with a massive Space Hulk. The Space Wolves attempted to launch a counteroffensive along the entirety of the front, routing what little disorganized forces of Chaos, primarily Chaos cultists, and some remaining Khorne berserkers, remained on the planet. The Imperium emerged victorious, but at a rather dire price, as close to 100 Grey Knights had been sacrificed in order to win the war for Armageddon. Though the battle was won, it was actually a harbinger of the trials the world of Armageddon would face in the future, as the scars that the planet now bore would not easily fade, and the shadow of Chaos loomed as an ever-present threat, ready to strike at a moment's notice. After the war for Armageddon, the next event of galactic scale that the World Eaters would be part of would be the Battle for Agul in 666 M41, and it was a bitter and vicious confrontation between the forces of Chaos and the Loyalist Fire Angels chapter. The site of this brutal conflict was within the Grand Argul system, home of the Cemetery World's ancient desolate planets, rich in both history and death. The warband of the World Eaters, known as the Sanctified, found themselves locked in a desperate and deadly struggle against the Fire Angels, a chapter of Space Marines known for their rather unflinching devotion to the Emperor's divine will. The battle unfolded in a series of savage assaults and counter-assaults, the Sanctified proving themselves to be a rather formidable opponent. Their terrifying ability to summon demons from the warp was rather peculiar within the followers of Khorne. However, it was not enough to overwhelm the disciplined Fire Angels. However, the cost of victory was rather steep, as all victory against the World Eaters is, and the Fire Angels suffered significant heavy losses during the course of the campaign, paying with both blood and sacrifice in order to push back the tides of chaos. Most notably, the Chapter Master, in a desperate act of valor, confronted a powerful Lord of Change, a greater demon of Tzeentch, who had joined in the brouhaha. And by confronting said Lord of Change, he was martyred in battle, as the Lord of Change, with its terrifying mastery over dark sorceries, was a rather potent adversary, and with the chapter master's death, a grievous blow fell upon the Fire Angels. In another desperate act, the Fire Angels' chief librarian self-immolated in order to prevent his body from being possessed by the demon's growing influence. This was a tragic yet necessary action, for it was the only way to avoid the horrific fate of being lost to said warp demon. Despite these sacrifices and losses, the Fire Angels emerged scantily victorious, and the World Eater's warband was driven back into the warp, but not without having left a trail of carnage in their wake and in essence succeeding in their overall mission. Up next for the World Eaters would be the long and bloody struggle known as the Siege of Thrax, which occurred between 813 and 830 M41. And what a bloody and protracted campaign it was, which stretched over 17 long years. It, in essence, was a fight for the Imperial army world of Thrax Prime, a strategically vital fortress planet where the Imperium stored vast quantities of weaponry, military supplies, and equipment. Situated in the Imperium's fringes, Thrax was a crucial defense point. Thus, its capture was imperative to the forces of chaos. In their pursuit of this conquest, they would launch almost everything they had at it. At the forefront of the chaos itself was the Sanctified once again, this time as a part of a larger and more cohesive concerted assault led by the Khorne warlord Zophor, a member of the Skulltaker's warband. Zophor was charged by the Dark War Master of Chaos, Abaddon the Despoiler, to manage the siege. However, Zophor's true motives were driven by a deep and insatiable bloodlust and ambition. He sought not just the conquest of Thrax, but the unification of all existent Khorne warbands under his banner, a death toll so large that even the god of war and skulls would have to take notice. And the chaos that was unleashed on Thrax served as a means to this end. As the siege wore on, Zophor, commanding the largest Khorne warband of all the assembled warbands, sought to further his ambitions by further enlisting the Sanctified. These Chaos Space Marines were known for their mastery over the dark arts of demonology, and were the perfect force to be used in order to summon Khorne demons into real space and unleash them upon Thrax. In return, Zophor promised them the ability to summon Khorne's most terrifying and powerful demon legion, led by the legendary Angron the Unbound, the Lord of the Bloodletters, and the very embodiment of Khorne's fury. The pact was struck. The Sanctified, with Zophor's backing, performed the ritual, as they used the lives of tens of thousands of sacrificial victims to create a massive warp portal, one through which Khorne's demonic legions would surge forth, bringing upon the world a slaughter that was in essence immeasurable. The promise of being able to summon Angron, a greater demon of nigh unimaginable power, was an irresistible one for the Sanctified. Yet their triumph would only be short-lived, as at the height of the siege, as Angron the Unbound was finally summoned to the battlefield, the tide would unexpectedly shift. The demonic lord, a terrifying and colossal entity, brought destruction in his wake. However, his arrival was met with the full force of the Imperium's might, which was headed up by Lord Hector Rex, a revered and renowned Inquisitor, along with a massive strike force of Grey Knights who would descend upon Thrax, intent on putting an end to this demonic onslaught. In a climactic and harrowing battle, Angron the Unbound faced off against Inquisitor Rex and his Grey Knight. Despite the overwhelming power of the Bloodthirster, the Grey Knights, renowned for their psychic might, ultimately prevailed, and the confrontation culminated in a fierce yet deadly duel in which Inquisitor Rex wielded an artifact sword known as Heresy to banish the greater demon back into the warp. The defeat marked the turning point for the Siege of Thrax, as the forces of chaos, shattered and disorganized, once again became a chaotic cacophony as their most powerful ally vanished, and they all began to retreat. The Sanctified, though diminished, were not entirely defeated, but their hopes of bringing upon Khorne's full wrath to bear on Thrax were crushed. The Imperial forces, however, paid a heavy price once more, as the siege had stretched on for years, and the toll on both sides had been rather immense, even by the Imperium's standards. After this would come the assault on Loron 5. The ice world of Loron 5 had been a secure bastion of the Imperium for millennia, its frozen landscapes serving as one of the Emperor's most far-reaching dominions. That was until the unholy convergence of forces, the warband of the World Eaters known as the Blood Legion of Khorne, and a ferocious wave of orcs descended upon the icy world's surface, setting the stage for one of the larger and more bitter conflicts this sector of space had ever known. At the forefront of the World Eaters was Lord Krull, a chaos champion of Khorne whose bloodlust was matched only by his hatred for the Imperium. Initially, the conflict was rather one-sided, as the orcs, divided by their chaotic nature, lacked the discipline to effectively challenge the deadly precision and power of the World Eaters. For years, these two factions clashed across the snowy fields of Loran 5, with the orcs failing to pose a true threat to the Blood Legion. However, the arrival of the infamous orc warlord Gruzguts, accompanied by reinforcements from his massive wag, dramatically shifted the balance of power. Grozgut was a master strategist amongst the orcs, allowing him to unite his forces and launch a successful assault on one of the World Eaters' primary and most important bases, forcing Lord Krull and his warriors into a brutal and savage close-quarters engagement. As the situation on Loran 5 became increasingly dire for the World Eaters, General Stern of the Imperial Guard recognized an opportunity when it was handed to him. He learned that the remnants of the Imperator-class Titan Dominatus, a relic from the Horus Heresy, were still lying dormant upon the world's surface. Commanding the 412th Cadian Shock Troopers Regiment, he launched an Imperial invasion to reclaim the planet and the ancient war machine for the Imperium, believing that the resurgence of the Titan would bolster the Imperium's efforts against the growing forces of chaos and the orcs within the region. In secret, the Eldari of Craftworld Beltan, led by Farseer Taldra, also made a move. The world of Loran 5, as it turned out, had long been a tomb world of the Necrons, an ancient and undying race, whose sleeping legions lay buried beneath the surface. Taldr foresaw the ongoing conflict would inevitably stir the Necrons from their eons-long slumber, and she sought to prevent the awakening of this terrifying and rather powerful threat. As the war raged on, a temporary and uneasy alliance would be formed between the World Eaters and the Orcs. United under the banner of the Forces of Disorder, they focused their combined efforts on seizing the ancient Titan. Their brief partnership, however, was marred by treachery, and when the 412th Cadian Shock Trooper Regiment arrived, the true nature of the conflict became clear. The Imperial Guard sought to wrestle control of the world, while the Eldar and the Forces of Disorder fought a battle for dominance. Farseer Taldr, in a desperate bid to prevent the Necrons from rising, succeeded in destroying the Necron Lord overseeing the Tomb World's reawakening. However, she paid a rather hefty price, losing one of her fellow Farseers permanently to the Orcs, along with many of her warriors to the Forces of Disorder. Meanwhile, General Stern, in his zeal to reclaim the warlord, was slain by Grozgut. His severed head would later be displayed upon the Orcs' infamous pointy stick as a grisly trophy. Lord Krull, too, would meet his end in the chaos of battle, his death sealed by the treachery of the Orcs, who turned on their short-lived allies, scattering the remnants of the World Eaters and leaving the planet in turmoil. The fate of Dominatus remains a mystery, as Imperial records provide no definitive account of its recovery. The whereabouts of the 412th Cadian Shock Trooper Regiment are similarly uncertain, though it is believed that they were either destroyed or forced into a prolonged retreat. In the aftermath, Governor Militant Lucas Alexander of the Imperium Ultima Segmentum Command was dispatched to the civilized world of Kronos, tasked with capturing Farseer Taldr for her role in the Loran 5 campaign, and for preventing the Imperium from gaining an incredibly powerful Titan. Thus, this mission would lay the groundwork for the eventual Dark Crusade, an event which would unfold with devastating consequences. Up next would be the 13th Black Crusade, launched by War Master Abaddon the Despoiler, and it was one of his most ambitious and destructive campaigns, undertaking with the backing of most, if not all, of Chaos. Amongst its many battles was the Daimor campaign, which occurred on 999 M41, and it stood out as a particularly bloody event. The target of the campaign was the Forge World of Amethal, a world vital for the Imperium's war machine and the home to a powerful relic of the Dark Age of technology, which held countless demons imprisoned beneath the surface of the planet. At the heart of this campaign was Khorne the Betrayer, one of Khorne's most infamous and powerful warriors, along with his relentless berserkers, and they were sent by Abaddon himself. After some rather bloody fighting between Khorne himself and Abaddon the Despoiler, where Khorne had the chance to slay the War Master, but Khorne intervened. Khorne was asked to wreak havoc upon the Forge World and secure the relic for Chaos. Alongside him were the renegade Astartes of the Crimson Slaughter, and together they launched a rather savage assault against the Cult Mechanicus, slaughtering servitors and cyborg Skitarii in their thousands. The violence was so intense that the blood of the fallen rained down from the skies, as a grisly spectacle interpreted by many as a sign of Khorne's favor. The Imperium responded with a force of Blood Angels, elite warriors famed for their ferocity in battle and their airborne assault tactics. The arrival of the Space Marines brought the forces of Chaos into a direct confrontation with an opponent worthy of their might. The World Eaters then found themselves locked in a brutal combat and struggle against the Blood Angels. But even the Sons of Sanguinius' legendary bloodlust was no match for Khorne, whose unrelenting rage tore through the Imperium's finest. Despite the tenacity of the Blood Angels, Khorne and his berserkers succeeded in cracking the demon cage, which was a significant objective for Abaddon, despite not capturing it and unleashing the uncountable amount of trapped demons, as it would eventually unleash the demonic forces contained within the planet. As their dark purpose was fulfilled, Abaddon's forces withdrew. However, Khorne and his warriors disappeared within a storm of bloody gore, vanishing into the warp just as quickly as they had come, leaving behind only the echoes of their slaughter. Now, in the era Indominus, after the sundering of Cadia, few events illustrate the mounting perils faced by the Imperium as vividly as the ongoing resurgence of both Angron and his world eaters. Following the catastrophic birth of the Great Rift, the galaxy was plunged into the Noctis Aetherna, a time when the light of the Astronomicon was extinguished, and travel throughout the warp became a rather perilous gamble. Nowhere was this chaos more pronounced than in the war-ravaged surface of Armageddon during the Third War for Armageddon, as reinforcements destined for Armageddon were swept into oblivion and scattered across the galaxy. Those left behind to face the relentless struggle for survival would be up a creek. Not only did the Orcs and the Imperial Defenders continue their bitter and unending ceaseless war, but both were forced to contend with waves upon waves of demonic incursions. Desperation bred fleeting alliances, with humans and orcs momentarily setting aside their animosity to battle the greater threat of the demonic hordes. However, these uneasy truces were short-lived, as they were improbable, for the very nature of these enemies defied coexistence. During this time, the skies above Armageddon bled with unnatural fire, and the landscape was twisted into a surreal nightmare. Greater demons of Khorne and Tzeentch, eternal rivals in the great game, clashed in titanic battles, reshaping the planet into a warped reflection of their domains. Fully half of Armageddon became a nightmarish hellscape, altered by these great beasts, merging the shattered remnants of a hive world with the malignant energies of the warp. When the Astronomicon once again pierced the dark skies, an Imperial relief effort led by 9 Space Marine chapters under the command of the Salamanders would occur, and they found a world teetering on the brink, half submerged within the warp's influences, the demonic forces seemingly having capitalized on this tribulation to initiate a dire ritual intended to bring Angron, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, onto the surface of Armageddon once more. The Salamanders, alongside their fellow chapters, launched a rather decisive campaign in order to disrupt this ritual. Their concerted efforts allowed the Imperium to halt the resurgence, preventing Angron from returning to the world that he had once defiled during the First War for Armageddon. Yet, even in victory, there was a grim revelation. In the era Indominus, Angron had become an even greater menace. The demon primarch now possessed a rather terrifying ability. He can no longer be banished from real space for extended periods of time. Should his physical form be cast back into the warp, he will reemerge unscathed precisely 8 weeks, 8 days, and 8 hours later. His return heralded by 8 crimson omens, a phenomenon meant to strike fear into all who witness them. Inquisitors theorize that this newfound resilience stems from the immense warp energies flooding out into the galaxy from the Great Rift, binding Angron even closer to real space. Even the most devastating Void Ship class weapons can only delay his inevitable return. At an unknown date in M42, in the wake of the birth of the Great Rift, the very fabric of the galaxy shifted, casting entire sectors of the universe into darkness, and opening the door for unimaginable horrors. Amongst the most significant of these was the Battle of the Lion's Gate, a cataclysmic conflict that erupted when Khorne demons launched an assault on the Imperium's most sacred world, Terra. Led by 8 mighty bloodthirsters, the invasion brought untold chaos to the heart of mankind's empire, threatening the very sanctity of the Imperial Palace. The forces of chaos, despite their savage fury and including a plethora of world eaters, were repelled by the resolute defenders of Terra, led by none other than the newly resurrected Lord Commander Raboot Guilliman. His strategic genius and unwavering loyalty to the Imperial forces turned the tide, driving back the demons into the warp. The victory on Terra sent shockwaves across the galaxy, offering a glimmer of hope amidst an endless sea of darkness. But for the World Eaters, this victory was more than a mere triumph of their enemies. It ignited a burning desire to erase the defeat that occurred 10 millennia ago, and led them to launching their own bloody campaign of vengeance upon Terra. The battle's aftermath would then set the stage for one of the bloodiest chapters in the World Eater's history. Following the Great Rift's opening, the forces of chaos unleashed their wrath across the galaxy. Another one of the more brutal offensives that included the World Eaters was the Blood Crusade, a relentless campaign driven by Khorne's thirst for bloodshed and violence, where the World Eaters' warbands alongside other chaos forces laid wastes to entire populations, annihilating worlds both within the Imperium and beyond. Entire Necron dynasties were eradicated, and even hive fleets were destroyed in the name of Khorne. The Crusade's bloody march seemed unstoppable. However, in a sudden and unexpected turn, the Blood Crusade was abruptly ended. The meddling of Tzeentch, whose whispers reached Khorne, revealed the existence of Nurgle's Scourged Stars, an empire of corrupted worlds in real space. Upon learning of this new threat, Khorne immediately shifted his forces, abandoning the Blood Crusade and turning his forces towards the war in the Rift, a conflict that would become a defining moment in the unfolding chaos of the galaxy. Amidst the Blood Crusade, another brutal confrontation had been occurring. The Octarius War, where the forces of warlord Ghazghul Mag Uruk-Draka and High Fleet Leviathan came into direct conflict with the forces of chaos, particularly the World Eaters, in a struggle that would see the destruction of countless lives and the stalling of Khorne's forces. The Orcs, ever unpredictable and fiercely resilient beings, had been clashing with the Tyranids and had unintentionally been dragged into an attempt to thwart the Blood Crusade, while the Chaos forces found themselves embroiled in what amounted to a bitter stalemate. But despite the chaos of battle, the forces of Khorne would eventually resume their campaigns under their god's command. But the Octarius War marked an important shift, as it illustrated the sheer unpredictability and brutality of the galaxy's endless wars. Up next would be the invasion of the hive world of Trasheka. Once a vital part of the Imperium, found itself isolated and vulnerable. The Great Rift tore open the very fabric of reality. With the Astronomicon's light cut off, Trasheka's inhabitants were left to fend for themselves. But from the ashes of despair, a powerful psyker would emerge, as a beacon capable of re-establishing communications with the wider Imperium. However, this very beacon attracted the attention of the Alpha Legion warband, known as the Unsung, whose dark intent was to corrupt this beacon and use it to further their crusade of ruination and chaos. But the Unsung would not have the planet for themselves. The beacon also drew the attention of Khorne the Betrayer and his infamous Butcher's Horde, along with all the bloodletters and Khornate demons that were spawned from the blood mist that perpetually followed Khorne, that at this point perpetually emanated from Khorne as a bloody miasma. And when they arrived, they would pursue their own bloody agenda. The Emperor's children, under the command of Lord Excurius the Flawless, soon would also follow, bringing with them the terrifying Keeper of Secrets, Sleth Kafor, who was summoned to lay waste to the world's defenders. The infighting between the Chaos forces escalated, and then yet another unprecedented force joined the brouhaha. The Imperial Fists, who had arrived to intervene. Commanded by Captain Petrov Dasorian, the Imperial Fists would be able to help turn the tide of battle. At the battle's apex, Saint Celestine herself appeared, her divine wrath striking down the Keeper of Secrets in a mighty and swift blow. Then, in a tragic duel, she faced Khorne the Betrayer, and despite her valor, her skull would be collected for the Skull Throne, yet her sacrifice was not in vain. Her final act initiated the destruction of the world's beacon, severing its link to the forces of chaos. And so the world was saved, but at a great cost. And the echoes of this battle will still linger in the records of Imperial history and upon the Skull Throne, where at least one of Saint Celestine's skulls now rests, as a tribute to the god of war by his most loyal of followers. Up next, between 001 and 025 M42, would be the War of the Beasts, which marked a rather monumental conflict within Imperium Nihilus, a vast region of space isolated by the Great Rift and under the dominion of Lord Commander Dante. The specific target of this campaign was the strategic hive world of Vigilus, and it found itself as the heart of a conflict as the forces of chaos, including warbands of the World Eaters, launched a massed assault in a bid to sever the Nockmund Gauntlet, a crucial route that allowed the Imperium to maintain supply lines across the Great Rift. The World Eaters, alongside other Chaos factions, sought to close this vital corridor, further isolating Imperial forces within the region. The War of the Beasts would become one of the more bloody and protracted conflicts within the region, one that would further shape Vigilus and the surrounding sectors for years to come. Later, at an unknown date in M42, the Imperial Cardinal world of Zendrea, a bastion of both faith and virtue, became the target of a devastating invasion during the era Indominus, as the World Eaters and a plethora of demons of Khorne descended upon the world, unleashing destruction upon its capital city, Vanheim. With the city on the brink of collapse, a small force of Primaris Marines from the Imperial Fist chapter was tasked with holding the Cathedral of Martyred Souls long enough for the evacuation of civilians. Despite their fierce resistance, the overwhelming tide of chaos proved to be too much. The Primaris Marines, led by Captain Wayland Cord, fought valiantly but ultimately perished. However, in his final act, at his final moments of life, Cord initiated the Firestorm Protocol, a contingency plan that called for the complete and total orbital bombardment and eradication of the invaders. As the last vestiges of the cathedral were torn apart, so too were the World Eaters, whose bodies now littered the destroyed cityscape. Though the Imperial Fists had paid a heavy price, they had also extracted a bloody toll from the World Eaters. Up next, again at an unknown date in M42, another pivotal campaign would occur. This time, it was the Battle of Ogivar, which was a violent clash between the Leagues of Votann and Chaos forces. Precipitated by the opening of the Great Rift, the Greater Thurian League of the Kin found themselves under the assault of the World Eaters warband known as the Purge, a faction of heretic Astartes who specialized in fast raiding assaults. These Chaos forces sought to destabilize the Thurian Chthonian mining guild and claim valuable resources from within the sector. Despite overwhelming odds, the oath bands of the Thurian kindred mounted a determined defense, and with the leadership of Karl Uthar the Destined, they were able to mount a decisive counterattack as they struck down the World Eaters' Chaos Lord Haktar, all the while rescuing the miners. However, the conflict remains unresolved as Chaos forces continue to press upon the Kin's territories. The region itself, known as Stormward's Front, has now become a nexus point for the Votann and multiple World Eater warbands. The next rather pivotal event would be the Arcs of Omen, as Abaddon and Vashtor seek the key fragments from an Imperial moon. An Inquisitor discovers an Archaeotech Psyker beacon on the same said moon, and had partnered with the Fleetmaster of the 5th to fortify it. This said beacon reflects the light of the Astronomicon and is a great help to Imperial shipping, in particular by aiding the Psykers through reflecting the light of the Astronomicon within the warp, not creating its own beacon, but rather magnifying what slim traces remain within Nihilus. Abaddon would then rally his forces, in particular those of Khorne, who he has been able to marshal, in large part due to the beacon itself burning Angron's mind in the warp, and so Abaddon was able to guide the demon Primarch of Khorne and use him as a weapon to directly destroy this pivotal point. Abaddon would then create a force so massive for Angron that it is in essence a legion-sized army of World Eaters, which appears wherever Angron goes. The void battles are truly massive, as hundreds upon hundreds of capital ships and 2 Arcs of Omen, along with the Conqueror, lead this force, as Angron flies through the void, taking on lance beams and being unaffected, all the while killing capital ships all by himself. Primaris Marines from many chapters, including the White Scars, Ultramarines, and Iron Hands, along with Imperial Fists, aided by entire armies of Sisters of Battle, Adeptus Mechanicus, and even Imperial Guard and Navy regiments, strike forces made up of Grey Knights, all attempt to stop Angron, throwing enough firepower behind them to wipe out entire sectors. However, Chaos, and in particular Angron at this point, are in essence unstoppable. The Inquisitors on the moon then turn towards the beacon and use it as an anti-demon weapon, preventing the majority of Khorne's demons from materializing on the world. However, at this point, Angron's rage is too much, and the power he has gained from killing so many has in essence created a shadow in this Astronomicon-like beacon. Strengthened by both slaughter and rage, he is able to summon his own personal guard of 8 bloodthirsters, as nothing the Imperium tries succeeds in keeping him down. At the end of the battle, the full power of the beacon is used, and the Inquisitor attempts the most sacred and dangerous rite of banishment, pulling power from 30 Grey Knights in order to attempt to stop Angron, and while it does slow him down, he is in essence unstoppable. At that moment, Angron attacks them directly. Feeling rather incensed, he cuts multiple Grey Knights down with his axe. And then, at that moment, as the rites of banishment are being completed, Khorne himself stands from his skull throne, and through Angron channels enough power to kill a star in a single swing, as the moon and the beacon are struck with the concentrated power of a god, leading to the moon being shattered, everything upon the planet dying, Angron being drawn back into the warp. However, for a brief instance, he sees existence as Khorne sees it, no longer filled with rage, no longer driven by the nails. For an instant, he wonders if he had finally ceased existing. However, unfortunately for him, he's too good a weapon to throw away, so Khorne just materialized him on another planet, ready for another war, with a litany of Imperial soldiers firing upon him. And due to the explosion of this moon and this psychic weapon, Khorne's murder curse spread throughout the entirety of the system. Every Imperial warrior left within the system, including all the Navy, the Sisters, the Astra Militarum, the Primaris Marines, the Titans, all instantly had their minds essentially broken and become tantamount to Khorne butchers, their minds broken in a frenzy of bloodlust. However, the question of if they were turned to the worship of Khorne still remains, as all they have left is wanton slaughter. Only the Custodian Guard, the Grey Knights, and the Sisters of Silence proved themselves to be immune. Eventually, Angron would face off with his re-emerged brother, the Lion, in a legendary duel which would shake the face of the galaxy, and said duel would go as follows. The warp-forged palace heaved with obscene life, sinewy gore, wet flesh surged from grates and valves, strewn through with sparking wires, glowing lenses, and gnashing metal fangs. Roadways cracked down their middles, then yawned like open-mile trapdoors, tilting battling warriors and vehicles down onto the furnace pits, where cogs gnashed and piston-driven crushers pulverized metals, flesh, and souls. High overhead, the arachnoid spines creaked into motion, their tips curled crown and inwards like mandibles of vast insectile maws. Gunships and flying demon engines were smashed from the air, descending as masses of metal and muscle. Shadows pooled about doomed combatants who looked up in despair before they were crushed. Through it all battled Angron and the Lion. L. Johnson was disgusted by his former brother's hideous form, contemptuous of the monster Angron had made of himself, yet he did not underestimate the supernatural might that Dark Apotheosis had granted the demon Primarch. The lion fought with every iota of skill he possessed, channeling all the lessons he had ever learned about combating wild and warp-tainted beasts. For his part, Angron felt little beyond the furious pounding of the butcher's nails. He dimly recognized the lion, but L. Johnson was just another foe to be slain. An eternity of unyielding rage and hate had blunted the Red Angel's capacity to revile one enemy more than any other. Angron would take his once brother's head for Khorne, just as he had taken those of so many of the lion's gene-sons already that day. The two demigods fought their way across a mechanical plateau where piston columns pounded manically and jets of white-hot flame erupted from hidden apertures. Angron sought to lop L. Johnson's head from his shoulders, but fealty was there to block the blow. Semiramis rebounded against the Emperor's shield, and the shockwave from the Emperor's power drove Angron back. The lion seized this chance to duck around a pummeling row of pistons and gained some space. Angron dropped his head and bowled straight through the slabs of machinery. He bellowed as he wrenched aside sparking mechanisms and hacked apart steel-braided sinew, only to recoil as the lion smashed the Emperor's shield into his face. L. Johnson retreated once again, a strategy coalescing in his mind as he clattered down the spiraling brass stairways. He gained a sense of his foe. Angron was devastatingly powerful and unrelenting as an enemy, but the lion thought he knew how he might defeat his former brother. Then his train of thought was disrupted as the stairway gave a violent lurch. Looking up, Lionel Johnson saw Angron had taken to the air, letting his weapons dangle from the chains strapped across his wrists, as he grasped the stairway's structure and wrenched the entire edifice away from the side of the mechanical plateau. With an oath, the lion leaped clear as the spiral staircase buckled under its own weight and collapsed. He dropped his cloak ripping behind him and landed on top of the roof of a Gothic ruin. Despite the tremendous masses of biotechnology that grew from it, Lionel Johnson felt a horrible sense of familiarity. As he glanced around the crumbling rooftop, he saw the hooded statues that dotted it. He did not know precisely what the structure had been, but he recognized the architecture as the style of Caliban before Imperial compliance. The lion had no time for bitter reflection as Angron fell down upon him, roaring like a thunderbolt that split the skies of dancing flame. The Primarch's weapons clashed and clashed again as the lion gave ground before his enemy's brutal onslaught. Lost to the rage Angron might have been, but hardwired instinct, coupled with the dark gifts of his patron god, lent him tremendous martial skill, unleashing a flurry of blows upon the lion. He forced open a gap in his opponent's guard before kicking L. Johnson's chest so hard that it cracked his armor and threw him through a statue with a punishing force. Sensing what was coming next, Lionel Johnson kept rolling even as Angron's axe slammed into the rooftop where he had been a split second before. Reaching the roof's edge, the lion threw himself out into thin air and dropped into the tilted metal platform some 30 feet below. He rolled with the impact and came up upon a guard stance, shooting quick looks at his surroundings. The sight that greeted him was a rather surreal one. This region of the Warpforge Palace appeared to have contorted atop vast unseen gambles, so that what had been a flat plain of riveted metal plates had now become a treacherous landscape of steeply angled ramps. Crackling energy pylons thrust skywards from between crooked plates. It looked as though loyalist and heretic war engines had been dueling here before the climactic awakening of the planet began. The Dark Angels and the World Eaters' battle tanks lay helpless where they had been hurled into the rooftops, or blazed where they had been smashed together, or had slid into contact with lightning-weathered pylons. More tanks and a handful of staggering Chaos Knights were still mobile. Some crews looked to be falling back, trying to maneuver their vehicles into more stable ground. Others, prizing hatred or vengeance even over their own lives, fought as best they could, even as their war engines slid inexorably towards oblivion. Angron swooped from atop the Gothic ruin and fell upon the lion again. This time, L. Johnson was prepared. Dropping to one knee, he raised the Emperor's shield and caught the full force of Angron's meteoric descent. Golden energy erupted in a tremendous shockwave, and the Red Angel was hurled back to smash down amidst precariously battling war machines. If the lion had expected a moment's respite from this gamble, he was disappointed, as Angron rose with an incensed howl and hurled World Eater predators towards the lion with an underhanded swing of his axe. Seeing the impossible projectiles coming, L. Johnson dove aside. However, he was not quick enough to avoid the next tank, a Dark Angel's impulsor that Angron sent slamming and bouncing end over end in his direction. The vehicle hit the lion and smashed him back into the wall of the Gothic ruin, hard enough to crater the stonework. Angron howled and charged, beating his wings to give himself more impetus. Bloodied and in pain, but knowing that he had mere moments to act, the lion heaved aside the crumpled wrecks of the impulsor and leapt atop it. He spared a moment's thought for his gene sons slain within the ruined vehicle, and anger smoldered within him. Angron leapt to strike the lion, and the lion dove aside, leaping away from the wreckage, hammering the Emperor's shield into the back of Angron's skull as he went. Propelled forward by the blow, the Red Angel smashed headlong into the ruins, and was buried in an avalanche of rubble as the wall came down upon him. Lionel Johnson swiftly backed away, limping slightly, dimly aware of the tank still dueling around him. Even as he kept his attention on the rubble heap, he knew Angron could not be so easily defeated, but he hoped he had at least wounded his former brother. If nothing else, the ignominy of being buried alive would have stoked Angron's new fury to new heights, something that the lion was counting on. The rubble heap erupted. Flaming chunks of masonry rocketed through the air, several striking the tank forces around them like wrecking balls. Angron came at the lion in a red blur, eyes blazing with hate, weapons swinging wildly. So suddenly and ferocious was the assault that even L. Johnson could not react in time. He managed to just barely bring the Emperor's shield up between himself and Angron, but the angle was poor and the titanic discharge of energy threw him backwards as violently as it threw his foe. The ground fell beneath him as the lion tumbled back down into fume-weathered gulfs beneath the tilted platforms. Angron would then bellow a war cry and plunge after him. The lion smiled mirthlessly, for here was the perfect environment for the culmination of his strategy. He faded into the smog, an instant ahead of Angron, who howled with fury to find his opponent vanished. The Red Angel was now apoplectic. Though incapable of feeling fatigue, Angron was not accustomed to mounting frustration to fighting an opponent for so long, while they maintained a restlessly defensive stance. He had claimed no skulls and shed only the merest drops of blood for what he felt was an eternity. The intense pounding of the butcher's nails suffered his being with white-hot agony. His capacity for reason had been drowned in molten fury and pain. To find his foe vanished then was nearly unbearable. Angron could scent the lion's potent biology and the lapping powders of his armor. He could hear the Primarch's heartbeat and footfalls, the servo whines of his battle plate. He glimpsed the furnace-like beacon of L. Johnson's soul burning in his warp sight, yet the phantasmic smog occluded even Angron's demonic senses. The lion, for his part, had less trouble keeping track of a foe that roared and snarled oaths and implications with every heaving breath. Angron hacked at half-imagined geists and bellowed with rage. In response, the lion surged suddenly from the flank and struck with the Emperor's shield, sending Angron recoiling into the air. With wings beating, the demon Primarch lunged, but L. Johnson was gone again into the fumes. Angron thundered after his prey. Again, the lion evaded, struck, and faded back from his enemy's lightning-fast counterattacks. In his mind, he fought monsters again in the mist-weathered Calibanite forest. The few times Angron landed a blow, the Emperor's shield was always there to block it and send the demon Primarch reeling back. All the while, Angron's rage mounted until it danced across his body as a spectral flame. His muscles and eyes bulged as though he might literally burst from the swelling anger within. Then came a piston, rushing up from the depths and discharging steam as it slammed a halt to its apogee. For a moment, it blasted aside the vile smog. The lion revealed in the act of slipping around Angron's flank for yet another goading strike. There was no thought, only the primal urge to kill, as Angron beat his wings and hurled himself at the lion like a living avalanche. He swung his weapon in wide arcs as he came, aiming to scissor through L. Johnson's neck with a move no shield could possibly block. Yet this time, L. Johnson made no effort to defend. With a blistering speed, he dropped to one knee, braced his blade with his whole body, and let Angron slam straight into its raised point, the demon Primarch's own impetuous drove the glowing blade through the top of his torso, and it erupted from the nape of his neck in a fountain of gore. Borne on by the force of Angron's charge, the two demigods rolled and bounced through the fumes as Angron came to rest on his back, one wing pinned under him, his corporeal form unable to reknit the calamitous wound, with fealty still transfixing it. The Red Angel thrashed and howled. One clawed hand dug into his wounded sternum in search for the blade's ichor-slicked grip. The Lion loomed over Angron, armor bloodied and dented. He gripped the Emperor's shield with both hands and gave Angron no time to react. With a roar, the Lion brought the glowing edge of the shield down upon the demon Primarch's head, driving it through the bridge of Angron's nose. With such force, it embedded itself upon the metal surface beneath. Angron's corporeal form detonated like a tank round, whose propellant was distilled hate, blasting his animus apart with a tremendous force, releasing a rage that even the demon Primarch's indomitable will could not drive back together. Al Johnston was thrown clear of the blast and came back up with his cloak smoldering and his cracked armor scorched, breathing hard as his body was racked with pain as he had sustained countless wounds while battling Angron. He limped back to the blood-soaked crater where fealty lay. As he recovered his blade, the Lion felt certain that he would see his former brother again, likely sooner than he might have hoped. For now, though, Angron was banished. The Lion sighed and shook his head. He turned his armor's vox speed to the Dark Angel's command channels and listened intently. Hefting his blade and shield, the Primarch set south towards the nearest extraction site. As he limped along, he considered his deeds this day, his choice of Jean's sons over the wider galaxy. He had so much to tell them, so much to do. It was time to rejoin his unforgiven sons and begin the work of ensuring his sacrifice had not been in vain. Behind Angron and the warbands of the World Eaters, a once fractured legion was now drawn together by the call of their Genesire. Even with him gone from the material plane, it seems that since the infamous events on Skalathrax, where Khorne the Betrayer shattered their unity, the World Eaters have operated as independent warbands. Yet the resurgence of their father, once again, drew these disparate groups to rally behind his banner. The diversity of the groups now within the World Eaters is rather stark, at points as different from each other as loyalist chapters of the Space Marines are to each other. For example, Gladiator Cadre 331 clings to their blue and white armored heritage of the Legion's Great Crusade era stylings, going so far as to include honorable warfare and the use of the Legion's old military tactics, dogma, and weaponry, while others like the Void Butchers have adapted their brutal methods to be better suited for shipboard combat. The Bloodstalkers, in essence an anomaly within the Legion, favoring precision and ranged firepower over melee combat, a trait that has garnered them no shortage of derision by their more traditional brethren, who see this practice as weakness. Meanwhile, the 66th Armored Company fights from the safety of their armored vehicles, crushing foes beneath the unrelenting weight of their mechanized fury, in a manner that resembles the Loyalist chapter variations much more than their traitorous kin. This grim unity has transformed the World Eaters into a much more cohesive and devastating force, with the differences between all these warbands covering the gaps and weaknesses of each other. Angron's resurgence as an active participant in the great game has made this legion a far greater threat, especially now that they have evolved and changed. Throughout the millennia of conflict, the World Eaters have remained true to their creed, spilling rivers of blood and stacking skulls into towering mountains for their patron deity. From the Great Crusade to the modern Imperium, their path has been one of unrelenting slaughter, leaving behind worlds drained of blood and reduced to desolation. With Angron at their helm once more, the World Eaters promise a future where the Imperium will face not just a legion of berserkers, but an unholy storm of violence and destruction unlike anything that it has endured before. The era Indominus, already defiled by turmoil, now faces the relentless wrath of Khorne's chosen, whose lust for battle knows no bounds.